She slammed the eviction notice into my wife's chest, the bold word indecency stamped across the page like a scarlet brand meant to shame her in front of the entire block. Elaine Porter, the board chairwoman everyone called the Iron Heel of Willow Creek, smiled as if stripping a woman's dignity on her own front lawn was just another day's work. Neighbors froze behind curtains and half-closed blinds, their eyes cutting through the glass like silent jurors. My wife's voice cracked as she clutched the paper, humiliation carving her smaller with every breath. Elaine thought she'd cornered us, thought her gavel-style clipboard gave her the power to decide who belonged here. But what she didn't know was that her empire of humiliation had just triggered the countdown to its collapse. When every fiber in you knows silence can't protect you anymore, lean closer. This is your moment. Hit subscribe now. My name is Daniel Cross, former military structural engineer, husband, father-to-be. I've spent years calculating how weight bears down on steel, how pressure finds the weakest beam, how one wrong load topples towers. Elaine thought she could brand my wife with shame and walk away untouched. She didn't realize she'd just built her own collapse point, and I've made a life's work out of finding those. The eviction notice didn't just threaten a roof. It threatened the nursery Rachel and I had painted lavender, the swing set waiting under the oak tree where my father's ashes rest, the small porch where my wife whispered that this house finally felt like a home. Elaine wasn't tearing down walls. She was trying to tear out roots. And you don't rip out roots without unleashing everything tied to them. Rachel's hands shook as she pressed the paper against her chest, her eyes glassy, her breath jagged. She whispered, "Daniel, why?" Not the question of confusion, but of betrayal. How could anyone wield rules like a weapon to disgrace another human being? Behind her, the oak swayed, branches heavy with autumn leaves, its roots a reminder that permanence takes years to build, but seconds to shatter. Elaine leaned back on her heels, the scarlet blazer catching sunlight like fire. "Violation of decency standards," she announced loudly, projecting her voice for the street. "This property fails to uphold the values of Willow Creek." Her words weren't for us. They were for the silent crowd. For the neighbors clutching coffee mugs just out of sight. For the ones too afraid to open doors, but eager to watch judgment passed. I felt the heat crawl up my neck, the pulse pounding in my ears. Years of operations had taught me when to stay silent, when to hold back. But this wasn't a convoy route or a blueprint spread across drafting tables. This was my wife, her dignity weaponized, her voice cracking under a lie. And silence was exactly what Elaine fed on. I stepped forward, boots hitting the porch with a thud, voice even, but loaded with steel. "You think this notice protects you? It doesn't. It paints a target." For the first time, Elaine's grin faltered. Just a flicker. Quick, defensive. Then it snapped back, sharper than before, her lips curling as she waved the clipboard like a sword. "Targets don't scare me, Mr. Cross. Non-compliance does." But I saw it, the slight tightening at the edge of her jaw, the way her nails tapped the wood of the clipboard too fast. She wasn't used to someone speaking back without fear. She wasn't used to pressure pushing the other way. Rachel's voice broke behind me, trembling, but steadying. "This is our home," she said, clutching her stomach where our child kicked faintly against her palm. "You don't get to decide what family looks like." The words pierced the silence like glass shattering. A few blinds snapped shut in retreat. Others stayed open wider, eyes glued to the scene. A neighbor's phone glinted from behind a half-drawn curtain, recording quietly. Documentation. Proof. The silence Elaine had always weaponized wasn't absolute anymore. I turned back to her, lowering my voice to a near whisper meant only for her ears. Every empire falls the same way. It looks unshakable, right until the wrecking ball swings. Her eyes narrowed, lips twitching as if to retort, but she stayed silent. Maybe she thought she'd already won, standing there with her clipboard and her crimson armor. Maybe she thought neighbors' fear would seal her power forever. What she didn't see was the shift, the crack, the moment when intimidation turns into overreach. Because this wasn't about rules or violations. It wasn't even about decency. It was about control. And when control is built on humiliation, it never lasts. The oak tree behind me creaked in the wind, a living witness. Rachel leaned into my side, paper trembling in her hand, her eyes begging for reprieve. I wrapped my arm around her shoulders and felt the fury settle, not as reckless rage but as calculation. Elaine thought she'd issued a scarlet brand. What she didn't know was that she'd just carved her own downfall into stone. And less than an hour from now, when steel and concrete collided in front of the entire community, her reign wouldn't just be questioned, it would be obliterated. Elaine Porter didn't leave the street quietly. She strutted away like a monarch after a public execution, red blazer blazing in the sun, heels snapping against the pavement like gavels striking down verdicts. Each step was deliberate, meant to echo, but the silence she left behind was heavier than any sound. Curtains shifted, shadows flickered, and though no one dared step onto their porch, I could feel them, our neighbors, watching, weighing, calculating what they'd just witnessed. The eviction notice crumpled slightly in Rachel's trembling grip. She was still staring at the word Indecency stamped across it, as though it were branded, into her skin. I took it from her hand and folded it once, sliding it into my pocket. A piece of paper wasn't going to decide our fate, but the humiliation, the spectacle, the way Elaine weaponized silence, those were daggers that cut deeper than fines or fees ever could. That night, the HOA office email went out to the entire subdivision. The subject line, Community Standards Reminder. Inside, a bullet point list of vague decency violations was spelled out. Lawn ornaments, visible laundry, overly tinted windows. And though Rachel's name wasn't printed, everyone knew the message was about us. Elaine made sure of it. Her office turned our private humiliation into a neighborhood-wide sermon. I stood on the porch after dark, the oak tree towering over me like an old sentinel. The leaves rustled in the autumn wind, their whispers carrying the voices of neighbors, too afraid to speak out loud. Across the street, I saw silhouettes pause at mailboxes, their heads tilted toward our house. Some shook their heads, others lingered, and a few, those who'd suffered Elaine's scrutiny before, kept their eyes down, afraid even of the shadows. "This isn't just about us," Rachel whispered, stepping out beside me. She leaned against the porch railing, her hand on her stomach, the faint glow of the porch light painting her in gold. "She's setting an example." She was right. Elaine thrived on patterns. Humiliate one family, remind the others who held the leash. Today, it was us. Tomorrow, it would be someone else. And that realization tightened something in my chest. Not fear, but resolve. Because humiliation spreads like fire unless someone smothers it. The next morning, the HOA newsletter landed in every inbox again. This time, alongside rules, Elaine included photos, cropped, angled, stripped of context. A shot of our car in the driveway, Rachel leaning against it in summer shorts, framed as though she were some sort of criminal. A close-up of a garden gnome we'd placed near the porch, labeled non-compliant structure. She didn't just want compliance, she wanted the narrative. But something unusual happened that morning. At the end of the cul-de-sac, two older neighbors, the Hernandezes, walked past slowly with their dog. They paused just long enough to meet my eyes. Mrs. Hernandez gave the faintest shake of her head, then turned away quickly, as if afraid Elaine had cameras aimed at her front door. That moment told me everything. People were breaking under her reign, but not everyone agreed with it. Some were just waiting, desperate for someone else to push back. I spent the rest of the day reviewing the HOA bylaws Elaine swore by. Her arrogance gave her strength, but her rules were brittle. I'd seen brittle beams collapse under pressure before. And one clause in particular, the very foundation of her so-called decency enforcement, was about to become her weakest point. She didn't have the proper standing. Under county law to enforce moral codes disguised as property standards, she was bluffing, weaponizing fear. Still, I wasn't ready to reveal that. Not yet. Timing mattered. If I struck too early, she'd twist it into another spectacle. No, I needed patience. I needed allies. And I needed one thing Elaine never expected anyone here to possess: proof of her overreach tied directly to the community's suffering. That night, I saw movement at the edge of the property. A man lingered near the street lamp, head bowed, shoulders hunched. It was Marcus Lee, one of the board members. He stood there for a long moment, as if debating whether to approach. Then he turned away, retreating into the shadows. But the hesitation told me enough. His loyalty was fractured. He wasn't entirely with Elaine. The next battle wouldn't be fought on paper. It would be fought in hearts, on porches, at whispered conversations near mailboxes. And while Elaine used fear to tighten her grip, she never accounted for what happens when silence begins to crack. For the first time, I felt it. The shift. Her empire of humiliation wasn't unbreakable. It just hadn't been tested by someone who knew how to calculate collapse. Marcus Lee's hesitation at the lamppost stayed with me longer than Elaine's smug email blasts or her snapping heels. It was a fracture, barely visible, but enough to show me that not everyone under her thumb had bought into her tyranny completely. A fracture, if widened, could become a fault line, and fault lines bring down whole structures. The next morning, I spotted Marcus again. He was watering the azaleas in his front yard, though his eyes weren't on the flowers. They kept flicking toward Elaine's house at the end of the street. When he saw me pass, his watering can paused midair. He gave a quick nod, almost too small to notice, then busied himself again. Body language said everything. He was conflicted, torn between his role as an HOA board member and his conscience as a neighbor. Elaine, meanwhile, doubled down on her crusade. Another community decency reminder hit inboxes, this one bolder, with photos of multiple families. Clotheslines circled in red. Kids' chalk drawings labeled as defacements. Rachel's picture appeared again, cropped mercilessly, her smile weaponized against her dignity. Elaine wanted more than compliance. She wanted humiliation as spectacle. Neighbors were starting to feel it. That afternoon, I overheard a pair of parents at the playground whispering, "First them, now us next." The other one shushed quickly, glancing toward the houses. Fear had made our neighborhood a stage, and Elaine was both director and executioner. But beneath the fear, I sensed anger building. I didn't just need proof of Elaine's overreach. I needed someone inside her circle to give me a window. And Marcus, his hesitation, the stiffness in his shoulders when she strutted by, he was that window. I caught him alone, later that evening by the community notice board, where Elaine loved to pin her warnings like trophies. He stood staring at one flyer, lips pressed thin, hand clenched at his side. When he noticed me, he didn't move right away. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing as though weighing whether to speak. "She won't stop," I said quietly, keeping my tone even. "Not until someone pushes back." His response wasn't verbal. It was in the way his shoulders slumped, the way he rubbed his temples like a man carrying too many secrets. When Elaine's sharp voice called his name from down the street, Marcus flinched. He plastered on a practiced smile and turned, calling back, "Coming!" But for a split second before he left, he looked at me with something raw in his eyes. Conflict, guilt, maybe even shame. That moment was enough. He hadn't chosen sides yet, but his silence was already cracking. Rachel noticed too. "He's drowning in it," she murmured later. "She's using him, and he knows it." I nodded. "And when he finally breaks, the truth will spill out." The truth I needed wasn't just about bylaws or legal standing. It was about Elaine's misuse of her role, about how she twisted authority into intimidation. Marcus had seen it firsthand. He'd been in the rooms where she plotted, in the meetings where she bent rules to fit her whims. His conscience was the chisel that could split open her stone facade. But Elaine sensed weakness like a shark smells blood. At the next board gathering in the clubhouse, she paraded Marcus beside her, making sure his presence reinforced her image of control. She barked orders while he nodded stiffly, but his eyes betrayed him, darting away, never quite meeting hers, never quite meeting mine, either. The more she pressed him, the deeper his conflict became. As I left that meeting, I realized something. Marcus wasn't just a potential ally. He was the key to exposing the rotten foundation beneath Elaine's empire. And if I could guide him past his fear, if I could give him the chance to choose conscience over control, the collapse of her reign wouldn't just be inevitable, it would be catastrophic. The oak tree swayed in the wind as I stood under it that night, thinking. Elaine thought fear was enough to cement loyalty. But fear cracks. And when it cracks inside the walls of her own fortress, even a wrecking ball isn't as dangerous as a man ready to finally speak the truth. Elaine Whitford didn't believe in subtlety. The very next morning after the board meeting, a bright yellow notice was stapled to our front fence. My wife found it before I did. The word violation screamed across the top in red block letters, followed by the charge, indecent exposure of personal property. They had dressed up her sunbathing with legalese, transforming a moment of rest into an offense against the neighborhood. Rachel's hands trembled as she held it out to me. "She wants us gone. She," whispered, her voice brittle. Behind her eyes, I saw the same humiliation she'd carried since Elaine first shoved that eviction threat into her chest. This wasn't about decency. It was about domination. By noon, the notice wasn't just on our fence. It was pinned to the community bulletin board, posted to the HOA's email chain, and printed in flyers that Elaine's assistant slipped into every mailbox. A smear campaign masquerading as upholding standards. I stormed into the clubhouse, the so-called heart of Willow Creek. Sunlight poured through its spotless windows, bouncing off polished floors and staged community photos. But the atmosphere was poison. Elaine sat at the head table, her crimson blazer crisp, pearls gleaming, as if the room itself bowed to her authority. "Mr. Carter," she said smoothly when I entered, her voice carrying that faux courtesy everyone knew too well. "We've received multiple complaints about your wife's conduct. As HOA president, it's my duty to maintain decency." She gestured toward the stack of flyers like she was holding court. "This is harassment," I shot back, my words sharp enough to echo off the walls. "And you know it!" Gasps fluttered from the few residents present. Some looked away, others shuffled nervously. Elaine thrived on that fear, her smirk widening. "Decency clauses are clear. If you can't comply, the board will be forced to take further action." Out of the corner of my eye, I caught Marcus. He sat stiffly at the side of the table, his jaw tight, eyes locked on the folder in front of him. His fingers tapped once, twice against the wood, like a man restraining himself from pounding his fist. He didn't speak. He didn't dare. But his silence was heavier than any words. Elaine leaned forward. "Consider this your final warning. Continued violations will result in eviction proceedings." The word eviction wasn't a threat. It was a bomb she lobbed into the room. My chest burned, not with fear, but with the recognition of what was at stake. This wasn't just a war over bylaws. This was about stripping Rachel of dignity, about erasing the sanctuary we had built brick by brick. I left the clubhouse with the notice crumpled in my fist. Neighbors avoided my eyes as I passed, their gazes sliding away like guilt. Only Mrs. Alvarez whispered, "Stay strong," as I walked by. Her small courage gave me more hope than the polished facade of that clubhouse ever could. Back home, I pressed my hand against the oak tree in our yard. Its roots ran deep, deeper than Elaine's fabricated authority, deeper than her endless hunger for control. That tree symbolized everything this house meant: stability, family, legacy. To let her tear it away wasn't just losing a battle, it was losing everything. That night, Rachel asked me quietly, "How far do you think she'll go?" Her voice cracked with exhaustion, but her eyes searched mine for an answer I didn't yet have. "As far as she thinks she can get away with," I admitted. But deep down, the engineer in me knew. Every system had a limit. Push it hard enough, and it broke. Elaine thought her rules were ironclad. She didn't see the cracks forming, in Marcus's silence, in neighbors' whispers, in the fact that I wasn't folding. She didn't know that I was already mapping her downfall, detail by detail, like a blueprint waiting for its final nail. By the time I laid my head down, I knew one thing for certain. Her escalation had crossed the line from annoyance into danger. And when you threaten my wife's safety, you turn me from a neighbor into something far more dangerous. The wrecking ball wasn't here yet, but I could feel it swinging closer with every beat of my heart. I barely slept. By dawn, my mind was already blueprinting every angle Elaine had used against us. Smear campaigns, public notices, the threat of eviction. It was all noise designed to drown out the truth. But the one thing I'd learned as an engineer was this: systems collapse at their weakest joint. And Elaine had built her empire on paperwork. That morning, I drove to the county records office. Beige walls, buzzing fluorescents, and the faint smell of stale coffee. Bureaucracy incarnate. But to me, it was a battlefield, with archives for trenches and file clerks as reluctant allies. At the front desk, I asked for Willow Creek Estates and Corporation records. The clerk sighed, tapping at her keyboard, before disappearing into a back room. Minutes dragged like hours until she returned, pushing a thin folder across the counter. "That's all we've got," she said. I flipped it open and frowned. The HOA's corporate status was listed, but the renewal date had passed nearly 2 years ago. The file should have been thick with updates, but instead, dust practically clung to its pages. No renewals, no current filings, nothing. Elaine had been ruling with expired authority. Every notice, every fine, every threat. It was all built on a void. I copied the documents, tucking them into my satchel with trembling hands. Proof wasn't victory yet, but it was leverage, an exposed joint in her armor. Still, I knew I'd need more than county stamps. Elaine's power thrived on fear, and fear only broke when the community saw truth together. Back in Willow Creek, I stopped by Mrs. Alvarez's porch. Her eyes darted nervously as if Elaine herself might appear from the hedges. "I can't talk long," she whispered, but I showed her the paperwork anyway. Her brows shot up. "She's not even official anymore?" The relief and anger that flickered across her face were almost the same expression. "She fined me for hanging laundry, hundreds of dollars." She stopped, pressing a hand to her chest, breath shaky. Then, in a quiet burst of defiance, she said, "I'll tell people. They need to know." One voice wasn't enough, but one spark could light tinder. By the time I reached home, Marcus was waiting near the oak tree. He didn't knock or call, just stood there, shoulders hunched, fists stuffed into his pockets. His face was pale, his jaw clenched like he'd been grinding his teeth for hours. "You went digging," he said flatly. Not a question. I nodded, handing him a copy of the renewal records. He scanned the lines quickly, his lips tightening. Then he exhaled hard, shaking his head. I knew it. She bragged once, said she could bend rules because no one checks. I thought she meant the bylaws, not this. His confession cracked something open. For weeks he'd been a silent statue, a man too afraid to move. Now he looked furious, not at me, but at himself for letting it go this far. "You realize what this means," I said, voice low. "Everything she's done has no legal standing. She's been bluffing this whole time." Marcus's gaze flicked toward the clubhouse down the street. "She'll fight tooth and nail to bury it. Then we won't let her." The weight of that exchange settled heavy between us. He didn't commit outright, but his silence wasn't retreat anymore. It was the silence of a man recalculating. That night, Rachel sat at the kitchen table, exhaustion written across her face. I placed the folder in front of her gently. She scanned the dates, her eyes widening. "So, all of this, the humiliation, the notices, it's just smoke?" "Smoke and mirrors," I said, "and I've got the extinguisher." She laughed then, not loud, not carefree, but sharp and disbelieving, the kind of laugh you give when the impossible suddenly tilts your way. Her hand found mine across the table, squeezing tight. The oak tree swayed outside, its branches etched black against the twilight sky. It had stood through storms, rooted deep even when winds tore at it. For the first time in weeks, I didn't just see a tree. I saw a symbol of what came next. Resilience sharpened into action. Elaine had stapled humiliation to my fence, but I now held the nails that could pin her empire to the wall for everyone to see. Tomorrow, the first hammer would fall. The next morning, Elaine struck first. A bright red notice fluttered on my front door, stamped with the words, "Final Eviction." My chest tightened as I tore it down, the paper crinkling like dry leaves in my fist. She wasn't just bluffing anymore. She was doubling down, betting that fear would drown us before truth could surface. Rachel found me staring at the notice. Her face was pale, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. "She can't really do this, right?" Her voice cracked on the word can't, like even saying it gave Elaine too much power. I wanted to tell her no, that the system would protect us. But the truth was uglier. Elaine thrived on intimidation, not legality. Even if the law said she had no standing, dragging us into court would still bleed us dry with stress. That was her real weapon, exhaustion. I tucked the notice into my satchel, right beside the expired incorporation papers. Two opposing truths side by side, her empty threat and her hollow authority. The contrast hardened my resolve. By noon, Elaine was on the offensive again. This time, she wasn't alone. She paraded down the street flanked by two bored loyalists, clipboards in hand, handing out community alerts. Neighbors stepped out, hesitant but curious, as she proclaimed that my wife had brought indecency into the neighborhood. Her words were sharp, rehearsed, designed to sting. I watched blinds twitch, phones lift, whispers ripple. But behind the performance, I saw something else. Cracks. People weren't laughing or nodding anymore. They were confused, unsettled. A mother across the street clutched her daughter's hand tighter. Mr. Chen shook his head and muttered something under his breath. Fear was still there, but belief was weakening. That's when Marcus appeared. He lingered at the edge of the crowd, shoulders tense, jaw locked. His eyes darted between Elaine's flyers and the neighbors' faces. I could see the battle raging in him, the instinct to stay quiet against the urge to finally speak. His fists clenched and unclenched, knuckles whitening. He didn't step forward yet, but his silence was no longer compliance. It was pressure, ready to burst. Elaine, smug as ever, stopped in front of my lawn. She held up a flyer like a trophy, her red nails glinting in the sun. "This," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd, "is what happens when people refuse to follow our standards." Rachel flinched inside the window. My blood boiled. I stepped out onto the porch, holding up the county record copy high enough for everyone to see. "And this," I said, voice steady but loud, "is what happens when a board forgets to renew its authority. Elaine Mercer hasn't had legal standing for almost 2 years." The street fell silent. Elaine's smirk froze. Her eyes flicked, just for a second, toward the paper in my hand. It was enough. The hesitation betrayed her. Murmurs swelled. 2 years? She fined me last summer. Wait, is that even legal? Elaine snapped back into her performance, scoffing. Fabrications, he's desperate. But the seed was planted. The neighbors weren't looking at me like a pariah anymore. They were looking at her, questioning. That evening, after the crowd dissolved, I found Marcus waiting under the oak tree. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at the branches swaying overhead. Finally, he muttered, "If what you showed them is real, then everything she did to my family was smoke too." His voice was low, shaking with equal parts anger and disbelief. "It's real," I said, "and I can prove it in front of everyone." He swallowed hard, shoulders sagging. "Then maybe it's time I stop hiding." It wasn't a promise, not yet, but it was movement, and in a battle built. On silence, movement was everything. That night, Rachel and I sat at the kitchen table, the eviction notice between us. Her fingers traced the bold letters, trembling. "How much longer can we live like this?" she whispered. I reached across, covering her hand with mine. "Not much longer," I said, "because tomorrow she learns her reign is already over." The oak tree loomed beyond the window, its silhouette steady in the dark. For weeks it had felt like a witness to humiliation. Tonight it felt like an ally, roots deep, branches defiant, waiting for the moment when fear would finally crack. Elaine thought she'd won with another piece of paper. She didn't realize she'd just handed me the perfect stage to end her act. Sleep barely touched me. The eviction notice glared at me from the table like a loaded weapon, and Rachel's restless sighs echoed through the house. By dawn, I knew waiting wasn't an option. If Elaine kept pushing, she'd grind us down with lies before the truth could take root. I needed someone else to stand beside me, someone the neighborhood trusted. So I walked to Marcus's house. His truck leaned crooked in the driveway, paint peeling on the hood. The blinds were half open, revealing flickers of movement inside. When the door finally creaked open, Marcus stood there, shoulders heavy, eyes ringed with shadows like he hadn't slept in weeks. He didn't ask why I came. He just stepped aside, silent, and gestured toward the backyard. The yard looked worn down, like him. Weeds choked the fence line, patio chairs sagged, and a rusted grill leaned sideways in the corner. Marcus sank into a chair, elbows braced on his knees, hands grinding against each other like he could scrub away guilt with sheer friction. His gaze stayed fixed on the dirt. "She won't stop until you break," he muttered finally, voice gravel rough. That's what she does. Picks a target, buries them under fines, and then points to the rubble as proof they deserved it. I placed the folder on the table between us. Inside was the incorporation record, the proof that Elaine Mercer's HOA authority had expired 2 years ago. He didn't look at it. His eyes stayed locked on the ground, jaw twitching. "She fined me last spring," he said, voice tightening. "Made me repaint the garage when my wife was in the hospital. Said our peeling paint lowered values. I didn't fight it, couldn't fight it. Not with her watching, waiting to crush us harder if I resisted." He paused, throat working. "I paid, but I never forgot." I leaned closer. "Marcus, this isn't just about me anymore. Every fine, every humiliation, none of it had legal standing. She's been running a theater of fear, nothing more. But I can't prove it alone. Not the way it needs to be proven." His fist tightened until his knuckles blanched. His chest rose and fell in jagged rhythm. Then he looked at me, eyes burning with something deeper than anger, shame. "The night she dumped that notice on your wife," he rasped. "I was there. I heard her brag. Told her lackey, 'Good, now they'll learn.'" The words hung in the air, raw and jagged. I froze. This was it. The confession. The piece I couldn't fabricate, couldn't pull from paperwork. Marcus had heard her admit intent. And in the eyes of the law, intent was everything. "Testify," I said quietly. "Say it under oath. Stand beside me when I bring this forward." His shoulders hunched deeper, a man caught between terror and redemption. "If I do, she'll come after me. My wife, my kids." His voice cracked. For the first time, I saw the weight he carried. Years of silence, years of watching neighbors fall one by one while he buried his own fear. I didn't push. I just met his eyes, steady. "She's already coming after all of us. The only difference is whether we let her win." Silence stretched. Wind rustled through the weeds, carrying the faint creak of a swing set next door. Marcus dragged a hand down his face, trembling, and then, slowly, he nodded. "I'll do it," he whispered, the words scraping out of him. "I'll back you. I'll swear what I heard." Relief slammed into me like air after drowning. My hands shook, but I kept my voice even. "That's all I need." Marcus leaned back, exhaling hard, as though years of silence had just cracked open. The weight didn't vanish, but it shifted. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He was a witness. The oak tree in my yard was visible over the fence, its branches swaying against the morning sky. For weeks it had stood as a silent sentinel, roots tangled with my father's ashes. Now it seemed to reach across the yards, steady and unyielding. Elaine had built her empire on fear and isolation, but fear was crumbling, and silence had just turned against her. I picked up the folder, tucking it under my arm. For the first time, I didn't feel alone walking back across the street. The weight of truth was no longer just mine to carry. Elaine Mercer thought she could bury us one by one, but she hadn't counted on her silence cracking open in the voice of a man she'd once broken. And when Marcus stood beside me, the wrecking ball wouldn't just swing, it would hit with the force of every neighbor she had ever silenced. Back in my office, the walls felt closer than ever, paper stacks leaning like fortifications around me. What had once been a workspace for blueprints and sustainability projects now looked like a command center. On the desk lay 2 weapons, the expired incorporation record of Willow Creek HOA and Marcus Reed's sworn willingness to testify. Together, they weren't just documents. They were a breach in Elaine Mercer's fortress. I slid the incorporation record across the desk, tracing the lapse date with my finger. 2 years out of date. That single line meant her so-called authority was nothing more than theater. Every fine she'd issued, every violation she'd screamed about, it all rested on a foundation that had already crumbled. And now, thanks to Marcus, I had a living voice to pair with the cold ink on paper. Still, I knew Elaine. She wouldn't collapse quietly. She'd claw and shriek until the last possible second, twisting facts into propaganda. That meant my evidence had to be airtight, layered, indisputable, immune to her venom. I opened my laptop and pulled up the files. Step 1, verification. I ran the record through a chain of custody protocol, stamping it with a digital signature tied to the state database. That way, if she tried to scream forgery, the system itself would back me. Step 2. Alignment. I synchronized the incorporation lapse with Marcus's confession timeline. His words, "She told her lackey, good, now they'll learn," fit perfectly against the date stamps on her eviction stunt. It wasn't random harassment. It was a campaign, carried out without legal standing. That narrative had weight. Step 3. Amplification. I drafted a packet. Official letters, notarized affidavits, synchronized evidence charts. Not just for the inspector, for the sheriff, the licensing bureau, even the local press. Tyrants thrive in shadows. Expose them to light, and their power rots. Rachel padded into the office, fatigue still shadowing her face. She set a steaming cup of tea on the desk and brushed her fingers against my arm. "You look like you're back at a deployment desk," she murmured. I gave a half smile. "Feels the same, different battlefield." She glanced at the folders, at the highlighted dates and bullet-pointed strategy sheets. "Do you think it's enough?" "Enough to crack her mask," I said. My voice came out harder than I meant. "And once it cracks, the rest will fall." Her hand lingered, warm against mine. "Then don't stop. Make sure it's permanent." Her words echoed in me long after she left. Permanent. That was the key. I didn't just want Elaine suspended for a month, or fined, or slapped on the wrist. I wanted her empire dismantled so thoroughly it could never rise again. By midnight, the printer whirred like artillery fire, spitting out page after page. Each document slid into labeled folders. Code enforcement, licensing board, sheriff's office. On the top sat Marcus's statement, his shaky signature still damp from fresh ink. His fear was obvious in the slant of his handwriting, but so was his courage. I sealed each packet, stacked them neatly, and rested my hand on the pile. My pulse thudded in rhythm with the weight of it. This wasn't just paper. It was a wrecking ball waiting to swing. The oak tree outside rustled in the night breeze, its shadow stretching across the lawn. For weeks it had stood as a symbol of endurance, its roots tangled with my father's ashes. Now it felt like a judge, watching, reminding me why this mattered. Elaine wasn't just attacking bylaws or property lines. She was attacking legacies, futures, dignity. And that tree, steady against storm after storm, felt like a promise. Truth stands. Lies fall. I leaned back in my chair, exhaustion dragging at my body, but my mind sharper than ever. Elaine Mercer had no idea her silence had cracked wide open. No idea her false crown was about to be ripped from her head in front of the very neighbors she'd terrorized. Tomorrow wasn't just another skirmish. It was the setup for her collapse. And when that wrecking ball finally hit, it wouldn't just shatter the walls of the HOA office. It would crush the throne she thought she'd built out of fear. Dawn came thin and hard, and I loaded the folders into my satchel like ammunition. The air smelled of damp asphalt. The cul-de-sac looked ordinary, but I felt the weight of the day like thunder. Rachel kissed my forehead, then watched from the kitchen window as I backed the truck out. Her face showed quiet fear and fierce trust. I said nothing. Actions mattered now. My first stop was County Code Enforcement, a bland brick building where bureaucracy moved with slow menace. Under fluorescent hum, I handed over the packet. Chain of custody notes, time-stamped footage, a record of the HOA's lapsed registration, Thomas Reed's affidavit, and the clinic note about Rachel's stress. The clerk skimmed, then led me to a small room. The inspector watched the trail cam clip on my tablet, pausing on the frame where the black bag split and the community president's crimson sleeve flashed. She asked about boundary lines. I slid the survey overlay across the table. She nodded and scheduled an inspection. "We'll inspect this afternoon," she said. Those words were small, but they set official wheels turning. Next, I went to the sheriff's office. The sergeant read Thomas's statement and the stills. When he hit the line where the woman in the sharp suit had said, "Now they'll learn," his jaw tightened. He arranged for a deputy to accompany the inspector during the site visit and noted potential harassment charges. That was enforcement. Witnesses would be protected and evidence would be logged. I spent the afternoon walking the block, handing copies to neighbors like I was handing out lifelines. Some doors cracked open, others stayed shut. A teenager handed me a shaky clip filmed from his window and scrawled his name. I'll testify. Mrs. Alvarez pressed a violation notice into my hand, voice trembling as she said she'd been fined for holiday decorations. Mr. Chen recalled a day his tomatoes were condemned. Each account stitched a pattern. This was systematic, not isolated. At the licensing desk, my hunch checked out. The association's corporate status was lapsed. The clerk stamped a review flag and promised to forward it. That tiny technicality undercut the president's enforcement posture. It meant past citations could be challenged as lacking legal standing. The stamp felt like leverage. By late, afternoon inspectors and a deputy were walking my street, measuring wheels, cameras, notepads clicking. A deputy logged my footage into evidence, sealing chain of custody. Neighbors peered openly from porches now. Phones recorded with permission. The presence of authority changed the cadence of the cul-de-sac. The air felt like breath, returned to a room held under water. Thomas arrived with a crumpled cup of coffee and signed his affidavit in front of the deputy, voice steadier than I expected. The act of signing was small, but it was a hinge. Once public, the lie had nowhere to hide. His testimony anchored the footage with human account. I drove to the community clinic and filed Rachel's medical note under environmental stress. The nurse stamped the form and made a copy for my packet. That medical link shifted the frame from petty HOA dispute to public health concern. It turned scattered complaints into a pattern the county had to take seriously. Back home, I compiled the day's work into a master folder: intake stamps, inspection requests, sworn statements, evidence hashes. I encrypted a drive and uploaded a copy to an off-site server. Prudence is part of strategy. You don't leave vital proof in one place. That evening, the cul-de-sac buzzed. Conversations started. Plans for a petition, talk of a special meeting, whispers of a resident coalition. Fear was still there, but it had been breached. People leaned toward courage. I touched the oak tree at the yard's edge, its rough bark grounding me. Roots held my father's ashes. Tonight, they felt like witnesses. I didn't celebrate. I double-checked every packet, every digital hash, each affidavit. I called the inspector to confirm hearing windows and the sheriff to confirm discreet witness protection. I rehearsed my remarks. Truth is surgical when you need it to be. Later, Rachel curled against me and whispered, "Thank you." I kissed her hair and said, "We're not done." The fight had moved from shadow into daylight. The wrecking ball hadn't swung yet, but supports were being sawn. When the impact came, it would be precise and final. Neighbors were starting to ask how to help. Mr. Chen offered his garage for a meeting. Mrs. Alvarez vowed to gather signatures. Momentum was building, quiet and irreversible. Right now. The morning of the emergency hearing hit like a drumbeat in my chest. I had spent the night combing through the packets again and again until my eyes blurred. Timestamps aligned, affidavits notarized, medical note copied in triplicate. But paper alone doesn't win. Presence does. And today, I'd stand before neighbors who'd watched silently for years, some out of fear, some out of apathy. The community center smelled of bleach and burned coffee. Rows of gray folding chairs filled the hall, faces tight with expectation. Some clutched fines like unpaid debts. Others carried phones raised already, ready to stream, record, expose. For the first time, their silence didn't feel like surrender. It felt like a crowd holding its breath. At the front, the county inspector stacked her files. 2 deputies flanked her, calm but unmissable, their presence a signal that intimidation would not rule this room. The projector hummed, waiting to flare with truth. I laid my satchel on the table, every folder inside heavier than steel. And then Eleanor Price walked in. Red blazer sharp as a blade, heels tapping like gavels, chin high as if she owned the oxygen in the room. She didn't bring a single folder, not even a notepad, just her phone and her smirk. The sight of her striding down the aisle, as if this were still her kingdom, stoked a heat in my chest. She scanned the room with eyes that dared anyone to blink. The inspector opened the session in clipped clinical words. This is an evidentiary hearing regarding alleged violations and harassment within Willow Creek. Nothing dramatic, but the silence that followed was taut as wire. I stepped forward, sliding the first folder onto the table. The deputy clicked the projector. The footage played across the wall. The hall gasped. There she was, The president herself, midnight framed in infrared, lugging a black bag across her manicured lawn. She glanced left, right, then with a sharp heave flung the sack over my fence. It split in the air, spilling refuse across the soil where my father's ashes lay beneath the oak. Her grin shone like a scar under the glow. The timestamp burned in the corner, undeniable. Gasps rose into whispers. Someone muttered, "That's her. That's really her." Phones lifted higher. A woman near the back covered her mouth with both hands. Eleanor shot to her feet. "Fabricated. This is fabricated. He's a technician. He could—" The inspector cut her off. "Footage verified by hash chain and cross-angle feeds. Custody intact." The words landed like a hammer. Eleanor's rebuttal crumbled under the weight of procedure. The inspector pressed on. Rachel's medical note was read aloud. Stress-induced respiratory strain from targeted harassment. The words weren't emotional. They were clinical, detached. But in that detachment lay their power. Neighbors leaned closer, whispers sharp with realization. This wasn't about lawn clippings. It was about harm. And then Thomas Reed stood. He was pale, hands trembling, but his voice carried with grit. He recounted the night he'd heard Eleanor's order. "Now they'll learn." He admitted he'd stayed silent out of fear. His voice cracked, but he kept going, finishing with, "I'll testify under oath." The room erupted, not with disbelief, but with release. Years of whispered resentment cracked open into claps, shouts, voices carrying rage and relief all at once. Eleanor screamed over them, face red, voice shrill. "You're all conspiring. Sheep! Without me, this place collapses." But her shriek sounded like the death rattle of power losing its grip. The inspector didn't raise her voice. She simply lifted the licensing report. "The Willow Creek Association's corporate status has lapsed. Enforcement authority suspended." Gasps turned to cheers. A woman shouted, "She fined me illegally." A man yelled, "She took my savings for nothing." Voices tangled into a storm of fury and vindication. Phones streamed live. The empire of fear had cracked. I leaned toward the mic, voice steady, carrying above the noise. She thought fear was law. Today, fear ends. The hall shook with applause, fists pounding chairs, people shouting as if chains had snapped. Neighbors turned to one another, not away. The deputies moved closer to Eleanor, not to protect her, but to contain the chaos she had sparked. For the first time since this war began, I wasn't just a man against an HOA president. I was standing with a community awake, angry, and unwilling to bow again. And if you've ever felt that surge when bullies finally crack, hit like right now, because this fight isn't over. It's about to flip harder than she ever imagined. The inspector's gavel struck wood, but the real verdict was already alive, pounding in the voices of every neighbor in that hall. Eleanor Price's rein had slipped, and the wrecking ball was swinging. Eleanor Price clung to the microphone like it was the last rope holding her above a flood. Her crimson blazer gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but the confidence that once radiated from her posture was gone. Her voice cracked sharp, desperate. "This community needs order. Without me, chaos will destroy everything you've built." The room didn't buy it. The faces that once bowed to her fines and threats leaned forward now, lips curled in contempt, fists tightening on armrests. Her empire of silence had flipped into a wall of noise. The storm wasn't outside. It was right here, in these folding chairs, in the voices of neighbors who'd finally found their courage. I opened my dossier one last time. The still frames gleamed, Patricia mid-throw frozen on glossy paper. The deputy slid them under the projector. The image filled the wall. Eleanor herself, the HOA president, caught mid-arc with garbage suspended in the air. Her smirk glared back at her, proof undeniable. Gasps tore through the hall. A man in the second row slammed his palm on the table. "She fined me for a broken shutter, and all along she was the one trashing us." Another shouted, "She took my deposit for weeds I didn't have." Voices rose like a chant, anger shaking the walls. Eleanor pounded her fist against the podium, shrieking, "Lies! Manipulations! He doctored everything. He's a contractor. He has the software." But the inspector's voice cut like steel. Verification confirmed across 3 independent systems. Evidence stands. The calm finality in that phrase left Eleanor gasping. Then Thomas Reed stood. Silence fell instantly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried with the weight of years. "I heard her," he said. "I heard her order it. She told her enforcer, 'Now he'll learn.' I stayed quiet because I was afraid, but I won't stay quiet anymore. I'll testify here, in court, wherever you need me." The room erupted, not just applause, roars, cheers, neighbors shouting his name, clapping him on the back, tears shining in eyes that had once only looked away. His confession wasn't just testimony, it was the breaking of chains. Eleanor tried again, but her words drowned under the chant. It started in one row. "Out! Out! Out!" And then it spread like fire through dry grass. "Out! Out! Out!" Dozens of voices rose in rhythm, fists pounding against chair backs, stomping against the tile floor. The community wasn't whispering anymore. They were demanding. The deputies moved in, not aggressively but firmly. Their presence framed her collapse. Eleanor staggered back, still clutching the microphone like a lifeline. "You don't understand. Without me, property values will plummet. You'll regret this. You'll beg me back." Her shriek sounded smaller now, shrill and hollow, drowned beneath the roar of a neighborhood finally free. The inspector's voice carried calm, almost surgical. "Effective immediately, this HOA board is suspended pending dissolution and special election. All enforcement actions are void." The crowd exploded. Cheers thundered against the ceiling. A woman laughed through tears, clutching her violation slip to her chest like proof of freedom. Parents hugged their kids, neighbors high-fived, phones recorded every second. For years, silence had ruled this hall. Now, joy and rage had ripped it apart. Eleanor's chair screeched as she shoved it back, heels clattering against the floor. She tried to storm out, but the deputies flanked her, guiding her toward the side exit. She wasn't strutting anymore. She was stumbling, cornered, every eye on her. Her blazer no longer looked like power. It looked like a warning flare fading into smoke. I leaned toward the microphone, my voice steady, cutting through the chaos like a blade. This wasn't about lawns. This wasn't about fences. This was about dignity. And tonight, Willow Creek took it back. The hall shook again, the chant shifting from rage into triumph. Phones streamed live, comments flooding as neighbors waved at cameras. The story wasn't staying inside these walls. It was already breaking out into the world. Eleanor disappeared through the side door, swallowed by her own downfall. But the sound followed her. Not silence, not fear. The roar of a community that would never bow again. And I knew, in that instant, the wrecking ball wasn't just coming for her office. It had already smashed the foundations of her reign. The community center spilled into the night like a dam bursting. Neighbors who once hid behind blinds now swarmed the parking lot. Voices loud, eyes bright. Their relief and fury, blending into a single tidal wave of freedom. The sound wasn't chaos. It was release. Years of whispered fear had been ripped out of their throats and hurled into the open air. Eleanor Price was gone, escorted out through the side exit by deputies, her crimson blazer a dim smear of arrogance fading into the dark. No one followed her. No one begged her to stay. Instead, the same people she had ruled through fines and humiliation turned toward each other, clasping hands, trading phone numbers, vowing out loud what they'd once only dared to whisper. Rachel found me in the crowd, her hand sliding into mine. She leaned against me, her face pale but glowing with relief. "It's over," she whispered, almost in disbelief. For weeks she had carried the stress like an invisible weight. Every knock on the door, a threat. Every letter, another wound. Tonight, she breathed without flinching. Thomas Reed lingered near the steps. When our eyes met, he didn't speak, but his nod carried the weight of everything he had done tonight. His silence had been Patricia's strongest weapon, and when he finally broke it, the whole system cracked. That nod said, "We ended it. Together." And then the growl came, deep, mechanical, impossible to ignore. Heads turned down the street, eyes narrowing against the glare of headlights. A flatbed transport truck lumbered forward, hauling behind it a steel giant. A wrecking ball swung on its chain, glinting under the streetlights, the kind of machine meant to erase buildings. It was headed for the demolition site 2 blocks away, but fate had staged something else. The crowd parted as the truck slowed, brakes hissing. The driver leaned out, pointing at the car that still sat arrogantly parked on the red curb. Eleanor's Bentley, untouched in the chaos, blocking half the lane like a monument to her ego. "Whose car is this?" he shouted. No one answered. The driver cursed, muttering about schedules and permits, and then, with a shrug, he throttled forward. The chain jerked, the wrecking ball swayed, and with one brutal swing, the Bentley folded like paper. Steel against steel, arrogance against inevitability. The windshield shattered, doors crumpled, alarms wailed weakly before sputtering into silence. Gasps turned into laughter, then into cheers. Phones lifted high, recording what no courtroom could ever deliver. Poetic justice. The machine rolled on, the Bentley flattened into a gleaming carcass. The symbol of her reign, destroyed not by lawyers or bylaws, but by the very weight of reality. Rachel's grip tightened on my hand. She leaned close, her voice soft but fierce. "It's done. Really done." The oak tree at the edge of our yard swayed in the night air, its branches arching like arms over the soil where my father's ashes rested. For weeks it had been a silent witness to humiliation, a monument to endurance. Tonight, it felt like more than that. It was a promise that roots hold, storms pass, and tyrants fall. Around us, neighbors began planning. Mrs. Alvarez raised her old violation slip, saying she'd draft a petition for a resident-led council. Mr. Chen spoke about repainting the playground, fixing sidewalks, turning fines into projects that built instead of tore down. Parents clustered, kids laughed freely in the lot, and I realized Willow Creek was no longer a cage. It was becoming a community again. I walked to the curb, resting my palm against the crushed metal of the Bentley. The air smelled of oil and damp earth, of change. "This was never about indecency," I said aloud, my voice steady, carried on the night air. "It was about power, and tonight, power came back to the people who actually live here. For the first time since this war began, I didn't feel like one man fighting. I felt like part of something greater, something that had survived intimidation and come out stronger." Rachel pressed her head against my shoulder, and I thought of our daughter, growing up in a neighborhood where laughter didn't have to hide, where porch lights weren't signals of fear, but of belonging. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. I looked one last time at the wildlife camera mounted on the oak, its lens gleaming faintly. That silent witness had caught everything, frame by frame, until truth crushed lies. My father's words echoed again. Always keep your eyes open. Tonight, they weren't just his words. They were the story of this place. This wasn't just my victory. It was ours.